Welcome to today's topic on the developments in Sudan, where today again clashes broke out between rival military factions in several parts of the capital after a 72-hour ceasefire expired. I'm honored to introduce Alex de Waal and can only highlight a few aspects of his very impressive CV. Alex de Waal is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation. Considered one of the foremost experts on Sudan and the Horn of Africa, his work and practice have also probed humanitarian crisis and response, human rights, HIV/AIDS, and governance in Africa, as well as conflict and peace building. During 2005 and 6, Alex was seconded to the African Union mediation team for Darfur, and from 2009 to 2011, he served as senior advisor to the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan, where he took on several roles in the negotiations leading to the independence of South Sudan. Alex, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. My name is Gerald Hainzl, and I'm with the Institute for Peace Support and Conflict Management at the National Defense Academy, researching African conflicts. I think, Alex, you have prepared a small presentation for us, and I would kindly ask you to start. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you, and I only wish we had a more cheerful, upbeat topic to talk about, because only 4 years ago, I think we were all enormously enthusiastic and optimistic about the extraordinary success of the Sudanese non-violent revolution, whereby ordinary citizens, many of them women, came out onto the streets and brought down the long-standing authoritarian military rule of President Omar al-Bashir, and appeared entirely on their own efforts, their own energies, to be ushering in a new era of democracy and peace in Sudan. And 4 years on, sadly, we see exactly the opposite. So let me start by making just a few remarks about the background to today's crisis. And I think fundamentally, this is a crisis of state failure. And if we analyze it, define it that way, we can begin to understand more clearly some of the dimensions of what is going on. So let me begin with the last point you mentioned on my CV, which is my role in the negotiations leading to the separation of the independence of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011, also a moment of optimism. And one of the defining agendas of those negotiations was trying to achieve two viable states in northern and southern Sudan. And that was a challenge because the oil reserves of the United Sudan were overwhelmingly in South Sudan. So northern Sudan, after the secession of the South, lost almost all its foreign exchange, about 3/4 of its oil reserves, and consequently most of its hard currency and most of what supported its national budget. So the economic viability of northern Sudan was in question. And the agenda for resolving that question, which was a combination of a shared economic zone with South Sudan, austerity measures in the north, and international assistance, none of those actually came into effect. The second thing that was defined as an objective in those negotiations, of which I was a member of the team, was that when Sudan split, it did not split into an Arab Islamic north and a so-called African south. It split into two African countries, each of which was characterized by ethnic, linguistic, religious diversity. But the ruling elite in Khartoum did not want to recognize this fact. As far as they were concerned, the political price of the secession of the South was that the North would have this singular Arab Islamic identity, which meant that conflicts in Darfur, in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, in these peripheral areas, as they were seen, of Sudan, among people who did not identify as Arab and Islamic, those continued. Indeed, they flared up again. And in order to fight those wars, what the government of Omar al-Bashir did was it upgraded and licensed one of the Arab militia from Darfur, the so-called Janjaweed, into a force called the Rapid Support Forces, which was given enormous material resources, enormous discretion. And that force, the RSF, under a self-made commander, Mohamed Hamdan Dagolo, known as Hemedti, came to be as powerful as the state and the army in Sudan. And particularly so because when Sudan lost its oil, around the same time, it struck gold, literally. There was artisanal gold, especially in Darfur, that compensated, not entirely, but substantially for the loss of the oil revenues. But that gold was in the hands of those militia. That gold was controlled by Hemedti and the RSF, who became, therefore, not only militarily powerful, but very commercially and financially powerful too. So that is the sort of the internal dynamics of the background to this. And that continued throughout the revolution of 2019. Let me mention also the external dynamics, because during the last decade or more, the Horn of Africa, and especially Sudan, has become part of the security perimeter of the Gulf states. So Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt and Israel, are very invested in Sudan politically, economically, but also primarily as a security actor. And this was reinforced by the policies of the Trump administration, which delegated its policy in the region to its favored allies, that is, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. So much so that after the 2019 revolution, when the single priority of the civilian government was getting the state sponsor of terror designation, which Sudan had been under since the early 1990s, which was in de facto financial economic sanctions, its priority was to get that lifted so it could normalize its economic relations with the world, it could get debt relief, foreign direct investment. There was no question that Sudan had long ago ceased to be a state sponsor of terror, but the Trump administration wanted a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo was that Sudan would join the Abraham Accords, that is, it would recognize Israel. And it was only when the military leader in the joint administration, civilian military administration, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, struck a deal with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to recognize Israel, that those sanctions were lifted. And that was too late to get Sudan out of that economic trap, and therefore that political revolution essentially was doomed by that transactional, highly cynical, highly myopic approach to politics. That allowed the generals to consolidate their control over the economy and over the politics, so much so that in October 2021, they believed correctly that they could launch a military coup without serious consequence. But they had this duopoly of generals, the General Burhan, representing the Sudan army, claiming the lineage of the state with support from Egypt and from some of the countries backing the Islamists like Qatar and Turkey, and his rival General Hemedti, with the backing of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the Emirates. They felt they had no agenda other than their own power and their own wealth. And when it came down to the question of which one was going to be dominant, they couldn't resolve that except by going to war. And that is what happened on the 15th of April this year. And my last point really is that whereas al-Burhan is a very familiar figure from Sudanese politics, that is a general who has taken power, who represents a sort of coalition of different interest groups, well represented in the Sudanese establishment, ideological groups like the Islamists, various political constituencies, various commercial constituencies. Hemedti is something different. He's something entirely new in modern Sudanese politics, so there are historic echoes. He represents a nomadic constituency from the very fringes of Sudan. In fact, his constituency crosses Sudan's borders. It's a sort of republic of nomadism, with fighters with constituencies in neighboring countries, Libya, Chad, Niger, Central African Republic, as well as Sudan. And should he prevail, there's no question the state as we have known it will be dismantled. Should al-Burhan prevail, the state as we have known it, which is deeply rotten, will, I think, continue down that trajectory of rottenness and internal decay. So the real challenge in Sudan is not so much getting a ceasefire between these two belligerents, these, if you like, these mobsters who've taken control of the state, but how we see the agenda of preserving the remnants of that state and going ahead with an agenda of state reconstruction.
Thank you very much. Well, if I might add some points, especially what you said at the end of your presentation, I think it's also a question on what will the future bring. Will the outcome be an arrangement by two generals? Will it be a breakup of the state? Because different regions might find the idea very attractive to break away, or is there a chance for a civilian government and democratic developments? Since I think these two generals 2 times stole the revolution from the civilians in the country. I think there is no doubt about it. Concerning the RSF, I think for them and for gaining more military experience, the conflict in Yemen, where they sent troops as well on behalf of other countries, was quite important for them also in order to get experience, in order to even to be trained and to know how to fight. And what for me is very interesting as well is that several years ago they were already close to Omdurman, and then they stopped, saying that they will bring the war next time the war to Khartoum if they start again. And we should not forget it's the first time since 1885 since Khartoum saw a war in this area. So I think it's also a tricky question, because on how far should international actors go and accept the outcome within Sudan? Should be a military rule accepted? Would it be, for example, a role model for other parts of the country, as we see in West Africa with all these coups d'etats? Or is it maybe a model like in South Sudan, whenever there are elections or the election date is coming nearer, they break up, start kind of war again, then they negotiate, and then they stay in power for several more years. You know, it's for me, it's not very easy also to see from how the historic perspective can be brought into the future.
So there's a very good questions that you have posed. Let me, in response, pose 3 types of scenario that we could expect. The first is what was in the minds, I think, of the mediators. So a few days after the fighting erupted in Khartoum, and it's not clear who fired the first shot, and in a way it doesn't matter. Each side was for a fight. So a few days after those first shots were fired, the Americans and the Saudis convened delegations from the 2 sides in the Saudi city of Jeddah, with the intent of negotiating a ceasefire in order to provide humanitarian access as the basis for the next steps. Now, what we know from many peace agreements, and I've been involved in quite a few, is that the first step defines the outcome. It determines the course of negotiations. So if you begin with a trying to negotiate a ceasefire between two warring parties, and you say, let us do that, let us silence the guns, stop the shooting, and then we will get on to the other issues. In fact, what you are doing is handing a veto or a control over that process to those men with guns. They will only then agree to issues such as power sharing, such as wealth sharing, security arrangements, democratization, justice, etc., on their own terms. So typically, the outcome is a two-tier agreement where the real hard component of the agreement is the power sharing and security arrangements, including who controls what wealth. And then there's the democratization and justice and all the other issues, land, social and economic issues, are essentially on a second track, which probably never materializes. This is, for example, what we've seen in South Sudan and many other cases. And essentially, this is what the mediators had in mind, a very conventional approach. The problem was not only is this approach flawed, but neither of the two parties are really willing to go along with it, because each is still intent on landing a knockout blow on the other. They each think that they can, either if they are slightly in the advantage, they can knock out the other side, or if they are slightly at a disadvantage, they must achieve parity before they negotiate. And I've seen this many times in negotiations. You never get to that sweet spot where they both sides agree, yes, this is the moment for a cessation of hostilities. The other problem with that mediation strategy is that the battlefield is only the tactical arena. The strategic arena is the resources. Who gets to actually have the resources to support their military effort? And this brings me on to the second scenario, because I think we can assume that first scenario is simply not going to happen. It's based on assumptions that don't work. So the second scenario, which is, I'm afraid, the most likely, is that as the two sides exhaust their material resources, a couple of things begin to happen. First of all, they turn to external backers to get additional resources. And already we are seeing this, particularly with al-Burhan turning to Egypt, Hemedti, it appears, utilizing his various networks. Also, one of the things that's happening is that the oil that is in South Sudan that is pumped through Sudan to Port Sudan for export, that money goes to accounts controlled by the army. And so Hemedti is saying to the South Sudanese, you have 3 weeks to stop paying that, or I will block the pipeline or take some other action. He hasn't specified what that action would be, but he will destabilize South Sudan. So the resources are the key. And as the two parties exhaust their resources, several things happen. They turn to looting. Their command and control begins to fragment, which means that the constituent units begin following their own agendas or turning against one another. And one of the elements that we've seen in this already is the mass ethnic cleansing in Western Darfur, where RSF units and associated Arab militias are essentially following their own agenda that they've had for more than 25 years to take control of this rich and fertile part of West Darfur, historically inhabited by the Masalit people, and take it over as an Arab domain for their people. And then other groups then get drawn in. So instead of what we have at the moment, which is two relatively well-defined parties fighting each other intensely, you get multiple parties drawn in, and a war of all against all, which is much, much more difficult to resolve. The third scenario, which I think is an option, but is a very difficult option, is actually to take the strategic element in the first two, which is the resources, and put that in the hands of the civilians. Now, what we've seen elsewhere, for example, in Libya, is that an independent central bank with a financial clout to finance everything, essentially, becomes a political player in its own right. Now, if the civilians were to be organized and were to be backed internationally by the major financiers, the major donors, the international financial institutions, etc., to say, okay, actually, the institutions of state belong to you, the civilians. You should have control over the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Irrigation and Agriculture, etc. Then the situation would shift dramatically. Now, this is a conflict resolution approach that has not been tried before, but could at least begin to break this current impasse that we are seeing.
Yes, I agree. I also think that the civilians should be in charge. From a theoretical perspective, I think it's quite logical, but from a practical point of view, I think Sudan had since 1955 only 12 years without a military government, and the Sudan Armed Forces are deeply rooted also in the economy. So I think we also should consider on how to solve the path out of it, and how to find a path out of it, so that the armed forces are controlled by a civilian government, not that the armed forces control the economy. So I think I agree with the idea, but I think it's quite tricky to achieve it, especially also given the international situation at the moment, that maybe some of the actors with strategic interests in Sudan might not go along with such an idea, or might have other ideas, or might use it to spoil successes for others. What I think is we have really to take into account the multiple parties, as you mentioned, because I think that there are on lower levels in Darfur, there are groups which really might spoil such a process. And we should never forget that it's not a conflict between the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces, but there are several layers in this conflict which should be resolved as well.
Yeah. I think, the points you make are extremely important. And one of the particular challenges here is timing. Because if we go back to the weeks before the conflict broke out, there was a huge missed opportunity. And the key to that is that, yes, there were a lot of external actors involved in Sudan, the neighboring states, the Arab countries, Russia, China, United States, all had investments, political, economic, other investments in Sudan. But none of them wanted the war. For every one of these actors, the war was the worst outcome. Because even if you wanted al-Burhan to be in charge, or Hemedti to be in charge, or somebody else to be in charge, you didn't want Sudan to be ruined. You didn't want Sudan to generate 1 million refugees, to be an economic black hole, etc., etc. And one of the things that was really missed beforehand was that it was a basic failure of diplomacy. The envoys in charge of the UN, the African Union, the United States, and Europeans, etc., who were engaged in trying to steer a process back towards a hybrid military democratic system, back on the path to democracy. They simply failed to sound the alarm that this conflict is coming, and that it needed higher level international engagement, the level of the Secretary of State, the UN Secretary General, the UN Security Council. And had they done that, I think there could have been an international consensus to say, okay, let's not let this happen, and make that quite clear. Because everyone, whatever their differences, even the Russians and the US, whatever their differences, they would agree on this. For example, Egyptians and the Emiratis, whatever their differences, they agree on this. The problem is, once the war starts, it becomes much more difficult, because then each side begins to support its favorite. That hasn't yet become the determining factor. We're still in a stage where there are still options for keeping that sort of unilateral intervention by different countries at bay. Some have begun to do it, for example, the Egyptians, but it hasn't become the defining factor yet. Now, in that context, I think there is still a very limited window of time in which an international consensus could be built on an alternative approach. So that, for example, the donors have pledged $1.5 billion for humanitarian assistance. And there is $700 million from the World Bank in the Family Support Fund that is sitting in the World Bank. That was suspended following the October 2021 military coup, but is desperately needed. Now, if the humanitarian response were to shift from the conventional response of sending aid convoys, etc., which has only limited relevance, especially in Khartoum, to a cash-based response, which is based upon opening up the Sudanese financial system, allowing those with money in the bank to access their money, which at the moment they can't, allowing the businesses to begin to trade, which at the moment they can't, allowing farmers, especially the commercial farmers with these big mechanized farms who need fuel, they need credit, they need money to pay their laborers, and they need it now because they need to plant this month. If they wait until next month, it's too late. If we could open up that system with this more creative, unconventional approach, then it has the potential to change the dynamics and getting a consensus. But I fear there's too much lethargy and conventional thinking in the international system, and too much sort of timidity in terms of dealing with new ideas such as this, so that the opportunity will be lost, and this will take the very conventional, predictable trajectory towards state failure, in which all our diplomatic tools of economic statecraft are extremely blunt, very, very hard to generate results.
Yes, I agree, and I think that also the very different interests of all the international actors, be it regional or be it international, I think it would be very hard to bring them together in order to follow one idea. And especially if it's a new idea, I think it's really hard to find an agreement which might help Sudan out of this situation. But you're right. The question is, what can be done now? How can the economy be helped? Because it has also an impact on other countries in the region. I read about Kenya, for example, that they have problem to sell their tea, which in former times was sent to Sudan, and it already dropped. The revenues already dropped significantly because Sudan is not importing tea anymore. So it has also quite an impact on other countries in the region. Sometimes we see it, like in the case I mentioned. Sometimes we even don't know so far on how far it could be, and especially also the refugees in the neighboring countries might create some kind of dynamics in the neighboring countries. What I'm not sure about in the moment is how neighboring countries are really reacting. I think most of them are at the moment trying not to get too far into this conflict in order not to get conflicts or violent conflicts in their own countries. But on the other hand, it's also in their interest to have a bit of an influence in what's going on within Sudan. So I have especially in mind Chad, which we didn't mention so far, because also the families which are living on both sides of the border, the experiences we had in former conflicts in Darfur, I think it puts Chad a little bit on the agenda as well. And I also get the impression that when it comes to negotiation and mediation processes, that the countries in the region so far did not provide any uh, solution which they might be able to follow and favor.
So let me pick up on those points. So first of all, the three countries that are most immediately impacted. First of all, South Sudan. South Sudan, because its major trading partner is Northern Sudan. Its pipeline, as I mentioned, goes through Sudan, and there are very large numbers of South Sudanese in Sudan, many of whom are now leaving and coming south. And also the armed groups that are active in Darfur also could operate cross-border in South Sudan. So South Sudan is in a very precarious situation. And for that reason, the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, was the first one to offer to mediate. And I'll come back to that. So far, not successfully, but I'll come back to that. Then there's Chad. And Chad is very, very fearful, because not only is it facing the prospect of a major refugee inflow, which will have enormous economic consequences, but also the armed groups that operate in that area are all operate on both sides of the border. All of them do. All of them have ties. So Hemedti has a lot of armed units that are drawn from Chad, and these armed units, as you mentioned, they've fought in Libya. Some of them, many of them have fought in Yemen. They are extremely capable, and they could be a major threat to Chad. But then there are also the governor of Darfur, Mini Minawi, and the justice and equality movement, which is also in the political ecology of Sudan. They also have supporters within Chad. So the whole that whole environment is potentially explosive. I'm pausing because you are frozen, and I hope. Hello, did you get that, or did it?
No, I'm sorry. I think there was a problem with the connection now, but I'm back again. Yes.
Okay, let me start the Chad. Section. So Chad has to be extremely worried by the situation in Sudan, especially in Darfur, for a number of reasons. First of all, a massive inflow of refugees, which has a big economic burden. Secondly, the RSF has many fighters, many units that are Chadian, and they could pose a threat to Chad. Thirdly, there are other political military formations, including the Sudan Liberation Army of Mini Minawi, the current governor of Darfur, the Justice and Equality Movement, which are embedded in the Sudanese political system, but also have supporters in Chad. So Chad could very easily be drawn in, and they will be very worried. The third country that is deeply concerned is Egypt. And the primary reason for this is that most of the Sudanese middle class from the capital, Khartoum, have ties to Egypt. So that is where they are heading. And already, there are several 100,000 Sudanese have moved to Egypt, primarily to Cairo. And the Egyptians are fearful that the number could be 1 million. And this will be a huge economic and social problem for Egypt, and they are demanding money. And the Europeans, of course, are now also worried that of this million, you could imagine many of them wanting to cross the Mediterranean and come to Europe. It's almost inevitable that will happen. So those are countries that are immediately destabilized. Now, initially, the African Union wanted to continue a sort of business as usual approach, maintaining its same special envoy, its same negotiating team, almost as though nothing had happened from April the 15th onwards. And at the end of May, there was a meeting of the Peace and Security Council at heads of state level, chaired by the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni. So that is the highest peace and security authority of the African Union, like the UN Security Council. And so they met, and they basically said, this needs to be made much more urgent, much higher level initiative. And they proposed that it actually be raised to heads of state level. The problem was that although they made that recommendation in the meeting, the African Union Commission said, no, we're going to continue with what we have. The commissioner, Moussa Faki, wanted to keep it within his own office. And this was basically a rebuff, almost an insult to African heads of state. So then, about 10 days ago, the leaders of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the Northeast African Regional Bloc, met in Djibouti. And they appointed four heads of state and government. The Kenyan president, William Ruto, in the chair, with South Sudan, Salva Kiir, Djibouti, President Gele, and Ethiopia Prime Minister Abiy, as other members of this heads of state panel. And essentially what they said to the African Union was, you haven't taken this seriously. We're going to take it seriously. So the Kenyans are now moving quite fast. They've had some pushback from General Burhan, who says, Ruto, you are not impartial. You have ties to the RSF, but they are disregarding that. They are saying this is, collectively we are impartial. We're handling this at a high level. They're also talking to the Egyptians, the Arabs, and the US. It remains to be seen whether this will really get traction. One of the things that I think is quite positive about it is that one of the first steps that the Kenyans want to do is to convene a high-level meeting of the civilian actors in the middle of July. And this is the first time, I think, that we're seeing the conflict defined in the round in a holistic manner and dealt with a high level of political energy at the highest level. But it's still enormously complex because there's a lot of diplomatic traffic, a lot of different actors in the mediation, a lot of potential spoilers. And it's not yet clear whether that or indeed any of the other initiatives will properly gain traction. The odds are against them, but I think this is the best chance that we have so far.
I think one of the problems is that a lot of those who want to be mediators or who want to be involved in negotiations have their own agenda in the countries. So it's also very tricky to put these countries in a very prominent role within the process. And what I sometimes miss is that we want to make a peace deal, but nobody is thinking about further. What does it mean in terms of the building of institutions in Sudan? How should a proper security sector reform really look like? And I think a security sector reform is very, very necessary in order not to, even if we get a civilian government, in order not to have the next coup d'etat within several years if somebody feels to be strong enough and does not feel represented within the government. So what do you think? How could a future Sudan with a lasting government and a lasting security sector could look like?
Well, I think the first duty of the mediator is actually to define the problem. Because if you cannot, first of all, define the problem and then get a consensus among at least most of the actors involved, domestic and international, that this is the correct definition, then you're just wasting your time. I mean, let's be candid. You will end up dealing with a minor problem or a secondary problem, not addressing the problem. So if we go back to the question of what is the Sudanese problem, I would argue the Sudanese problem is fundamentally the viability of the state. So, and to be viable, a state has to be, financially sound. It needs to have a legitimate government that is accepted by its people. It needs to be able to govern the diverse peoples within its domain, and it has to have at least some room for maneuver, some autonomy, so that it can sort of define national goals and strategies. So I think this is the basic challenge for Sudan, which is a very, very deep challenge. But unless we get the actors, including the civilians, the armed actors, the neighboring countries and others, to agree on such a definition and align their basic policies along these lines. I think we're wasting our time. And then within specific parts of Sudan, such as Darfur, there are very particular problems specific to those areas. So the crisis in Darfur, as it has been for almost 20 years, has two levels. There's the question of Darfur's place within Sudan, the need for Darfurians to be recognized as, fully equal citizens of a democratic developmental Sudan, which has never happened. And then you have the problem of, as it were, the Darfurian crisis in Darfur, how the communities relate to each other, how they resolve their differences. And that can only be overcome if there is civilian leadership of the communities. And attempts to initiate these processes by the African Union, which I was involved in some 12, 13 years ago, did not succeed. They were blocked both by the Sudanese and by the internationals, who wanted exactly that kind of shortcut deal among the belligerents that is what mediators tend to go for at the expense of dealing with a longer-term problem. So what we're seeing is that the legacy of the failure to resolve these fundamental problems, which I'm afraid until we get to that consensus around these problems, we're not going to go anywhere towards a solution. And you mentioned in particular the role of the military in commerce. And I think this is an outcome of a variety of factors. It's an outcome of the failure of the state over many decades to have a professional army that can be subordinate to the state, so that army officers and paramilitaries end up utilizing their position for private enrichment. And so there's a process of state capture that goes on there. And then the more that the viability of the state and the state finances are in question, the more the incentive is for these sort of military commercial operators to seize what they can, to become kleptocrats, to the point at which they bankrupt the state. And if there's one thing worse than a kleptocracy, it's a bankrupt kleptocracy, because a kleptocracy at least keeps something functioning. When they go bankrupt, it's like a mobster shootout, and that is what we are seeing. So the fundamental part of the agenda of reconstituting the state is demilitarizing the state, and this is probably the single most challenging, the most difficult agenda.
Yes, that's what I see. That's why I ask this question. That's what I see again. But maybe let's move on to the bigger international actors. Do you see a competition between great powers in Sudan now on who might get influenced through this situation, who might be the chief mediator in this situation? I think at the beginning of the conflict, there was a bit of a competition between the US and China on who might be more involved in the mediation process and maybe gain some points there, in not only in Sudan but also in the wider region.
I think, funnily enough, I think most of the key international actors, including China and even Russia, they were not unhappy to have the US take the lead for two reasons. One, if the US succeeded, at least there would be some stability in Sudan, and that suited everyone. But secondly, everyone actually who looked at this critically thought the US is going to fail. So let us and then let us move in to support whatever follows. And I think the potential for the IGAD initiative is that it actually can have credibility with the US, with Europe, with Russia, with China. Its biggest challenge is going to be to have credibility with the Arab countries. And that requires both diplomatic and political work by its key members, especially the Kenyans and the Djiboutians, but also for it to build an external constituency of friends and supporters. Mm-hmm. And its problem there is that the African Union and the UN had already gone a fair way down the track of getting buy-in for their very low profile, low wattage, low energy efforts. Mm-hmm. And so there will be some basically who are lazy-minded, who think, okay, let's stick with this process that we already bought into. If you ask us, we can't explain mm-hmm. how it's going to succeed, mm-hmm. but we'd rather be seen to be part of this process than take the risk of backing something that is bolder and higher profile, that maybe is taking a few mm-hmm. risks in order to seize the chance of success.
Mm-hmm. Another actor which you only mentioned when it came to migration from Sudan to Europe. Do you see any role for European countries or for the European Union in this conflict, or is the European Union or the member states just not an actor at all?
The European Union could be an actor, and part of the tragedy here is that until a few years ago, the United Kingdom was the lead European actor, mm-hmm. and actually had a great deal of expertise in Sudan, and was able not only to command its own diplomatic resources, its own financial resources. Its aid budget for Sudan was mm-hmm. 10 times bigger mm-hmm. 10 years ago than it is now, but also could bring in the European Union, and therefore could be a really respected actor. And since Britain sort of resigned itself from the world stage, and all the British expertise is now going to waste because they have no money and no influence, the Europeans have not, sadly, moved into that gap. But so there is a bit of a vacuum there that could be filled with some creative diplomacy if European nations were to work alongside mm-hmm. the British. The British could get over their their what I call the Brexidiocy, yeah. and make a positive contribution. And I think they will have to do that, because if they don't, mm-hmm. there is the next refugee crisis in the Mediterranean is yes, on the horizon.
Yes, I agree. I have a question. Since we have to come to an end, I guess we are almost approaching we already approached our 45 minutes. How long do you think might this confrontational situation in Sudan last?
I think there is a small chance for dramatic action in the next 2 months, freezing the state collapse and allowing reconstruction over the next few years. If that does not happen, everything we know about state collapse is that it will be 1, 2, 3 decades before we're able to get back to where we are. So there is I think, a very bleak prospect if urgent action is not taken.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for our conversation, and I enjoyed it very much, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope we get another chance soon with a more optimistic scenario to discuss.
I hope so as well. Thank you.